Listening is the cornerstone of language learning, yet many students struggle to improve their Mandarin listening comprehension. Fortunately, making progress isn't as difficult as you might think. Just follow these 4 key principles. Hello and welcome to the Hacking Chinese podcast. In this week's episode, we're going to talk about listening comprehension and how to improve it. This is both easy and hard at the same time, because while the principles that I'm going to discuss in this episode are not very hard to explain or understand, they can of course still be hard to implement in practice. My goal today is to go through these 4 key principles and explain them so that you can then rely on them when you practice your listening comprehension. I think listening comprehension is the most important skill to develop in Mandarin because it gives you the ability to engage in conversations and connect with people, which is something that you can then use to accelerate your learning in all other areas. When you understand more, you will also learn more, so this is an auspicious cycle. If you boost your listening comprehension a bit, that will lead to you understanding more of the Chinese that you're exposed to, and that will help you learn even more, which will in turn enable you to understand even more. So the earlier you get this cycle going, the better. Listening comprehension is also practically useful for many other things. For example, if you want to work in Chinese or study in Chinese, you certainly need a good listening comprehension. And if you want to pass proficiency exams, you need good listening ability as well. Despite all these benefits, many students find listening very challenging. I remember personally what it was like to study Chinese at university for a year here in Sweden, and then arrive in Taiwan and suddenly realize that when I ask questions, people understand what I'm saying, but I don't understand what they are saying to me. So for example, when I asked for directions, yes, I could do that with the Chinese that I'd learned, but I didn't really understand what people responded, so it didn't help much. Or when I wanted to ask some questions about how to order in a restaurant or about the food itself, I could convey this in Chinese, but my listening ability was not good enough to understand the information I was then presented. Another problem I think many of you have experienced is that words really sound very similar in Mandarin sometimes, and this is not just an illusion, words really do sound more similar. And another challenge is that native speakers speak so fast. Well, native speakers of any language can speak quickly, but as foreigners, when we learn the language, this speed becomes a problem. So how can we overcome these challenges and improve our listening ability in Mandarin? Well, one thing that is clear from my own experience, and since then I've also read a ton of research about this and talked to many students, is that the typical formal educational setting does not prepare you for real-world listening. Listening is simply not the focus of most university courses in Chinese, and the written language takes precedent. So if you've been enrolled in a university course, you might have noticed that most exams are written, and if you're going to test something, it's usually your knowledge of characters, either writing them yourself or reading them. In many cases, the instruction is not in Chinese either, so you are learning about the language rather than learning the language. This doesn't give you enough opportunities to engage with the language, and so it's natural that after 1 year of this, I wasn't really prepared to speak with real people. So what should I have done? What is a good approach to listening comprehension in Mandarin? As mentioned, there are 4 key principles that I will discuss in detail later in this episode, but let's have a look at all 4 of them first. They are, number 1, listen more because quantity is key. Second, understand more because this is what allows us to build sound meaning connections. And third, communicate more, which means focusing on meaning and listening with a purpose that is beyond simply practicing the language. And fourth, enjoy yourself, because this is what makes your approach sustainable in the long run. These 4 principles form the foundation of my new course, The Fluent Listener, Navigating Spoken Mandarin Like a Fish in Water. And before I talk about these principles in more detail, I want to say a few words about this course. It's designed to help you reap all the benefits that strong listening comprehension entails, including those that I mentioned earlier in this episode, such as being able to navigate conversations, build connections with people, pass exams, function in social situations at work, and so on. Improving listening ability is also the best way to accelerate your learning in general, because it will give you access to a lot more learning opportunities when you understand more of what's going on, and you will then also learn more from the Chinese that you engage with. And this is true regardless if you live in an immersion environment or if you study from home. And as mentioned, the earlier you can get this auspicious spiral started, the better. The Fluent Listener will open for registration next Monday, that's November 18th, and remain open for the rest of that week. For more information about the course, you can go to hackingchinese.com/courses and select the listening course, or you can go to listening.hackingchinese.com. If you're listening to this in the future or the course is not open when you get there, you will be able to leave your email address so I can contact you when the course opens again. Once you're enrolled in the course, and this is true for all of my courses, you have lifetime access to the content, so you can study it at your own pace. So check out the Fluent Listener at listening.hackingchinese.com. Now that we have that out of the way, let's focus on the 4 key principles that my course is built on, and this is meant to be useful regardless of if you're interested in the course or not. So the first principle is listen more, quantity is key. This should come as no surprise. I've talked about this on the podcast many times, but learning is really like an equation where you have several factors in it. So for example, how much you study, the method you use, and the content that you study. But if you multiply anything with 0, the final result is also 0. This means that you can have the best approach in the world and the best learning materials, but if you don't spend any time listening, you will not learn anything. The only way you can download new information about Mandarin into your brain is either through your ears or your eyes, and since we're talking about listening, it's the ears that are the key here. On the one hand, I think this is obvious. If you don't listen to Mandarin, you will not know what it sounds like, and there is no way you can figure out how grammar works and how words are used and so on. On the other hand, this maybe isn't as obvious as I think it is, because most students, and indeed teachers, don't focus on listening nearly as much as they should. The best way is to create a Mandarin bubble or your own immersion environment. This is certainly easier if you live in a Chinese-speaking environment, but if you think about it, most of the time you're not actually interacting with people anyway, so you need to create this environment even if it's all around you. Now, if you don't live in a Chinese-speaking environment, it's crucial that you create this Mandarin bubble yourself. This doesn't need to happen all at once or be extreme in any way, but gradually building up your immersion environment so that you do automatically or naturally get exposed to more language and engage with it is important. These are of course things that I cover in the course, but I have written about some of these things on Hacking Chinese before, and as usual, I'll put lots of links in the show notes. For example, to create your immersion environment, it's great to build good habits, because those will allow you to listen a lot more without necessarily feeling that you're investing a lot more energy or effort. It's also important that you make a listening practice as streamlined and frictionless as possible, because that makes it much more likely that you will get started, and also more likely that you will stay in the listening mode. Another thing you can try is the forking path approach, which I talked about in episode 18. And this is essentially regarding everyday life as a series of micro choices. And if you consistently try to make choices that include more Chinese, this will then in the long run make a very big difference for how much Chinese you engage with. Anyway, principle 1 is to listen more, and this is very easy to say, but not so easy to implement. Moving on to principle number 2, which is to understand more so that you can build sound meaning connections. This is about what makes us develop comprehension in a language. And when we're talking about listening, this means that you need to hear something, that's a sound, and you need to be able to connect it to meaning. If you're able to do that, you can, at least in theory, make sense of what's being said. For example, if you just started learning Chinese and you hear someone say ni hao, and you're able to connect that to the meaning of this is a greeting, then you have learned something. You didn't learn anything new necessarily, but the processing of this specific phrase was sped up a little bit, and next time you hear it, you will find it easier to understand. You might also have learned other things, so this is just an example. If you're listening to your friend talking about what they did this weekend, if you don't understand anything of what's going on, you're unlikely to pick up any new words, and you might not learn how these words are used or the grammar or anything like that. But if you do understand what they're saying, you are both reinforcing things that you had already learned before, and you also have an opportunity to learn things you didn't know. So how can you understand more when you practice listening ability in Mandarin? Well, the first thing is kind of obvious. You choose listening materials that are suited to your level. And I have lots of recommendations for how to do that and what resources to pick on Hacking Chinese already, and there are even more in the Fluent Listener. Next, you can also scaffold your listening in different ways. So this might involve having support of different kinds. Maybe you're watching a video where someone is speaking Mandarin, which is certainly easier to understand than if you just have the audio. Or maybe you just have some pictures to go along with the audio, or you have some idea what this is about in advance. You can also use other methods such as listening again if you're listening digitally, or maybe slowing down the playback speed. Next, there are many listening strategies you can use. So these are essentially ways of focusing your attention and using different techniques to understand more. And this is something I actually haven't written that much about on Hacking Chinese, but which is part of the Fluent Listener. I have, however, written about many of the other things I mentioned, and as usual then I'll put links in the show notes. So to summarize, principle number 2 is about comprehensible input. You need to understand what you're listening to, otherwise you won't benefit much. And no, this doesn't mean you need to understand everything all the time, but it does mean that you learn more if you also understand more. This brings us to principle number 3. Communicate more, focus on meaning and purpose. This was perhaps the factor that was missing the most when I started learning at university, and something I've observed many times with teachers and students. The problem is that listening is often something you do just to practice the language. For example, you might listen to the text in your textbook, or you might see how things are pronounced, or you do various forms of activities that target certain parts of the language. For example, you do a fill in the blanks to see if you can hear and identify the words, or you do various other similar types of activities. The problem is that this type of practicing is not about communication and it's not about meaning. This means that when you leave the classroom and join the world, you will be surprised and also maybe a bit dismayed, because the exercises you did in the classroom won't really help you prepare for what's coming outside. And that is because when people talk with each other in the real world, it is all about meaning and it's all purposeful. When someone is answering your question in Chinese and they tell you how to get to the gym or how to order at this restaurant, then they are not trying to practice certain words or grammar patterns or see if you've learned them. They're trying to communicate with you. The problem is that this situation requires a completely different skill set from the one that is required if you've only done typical textbook and classroom listening. And this is why this principle is so important. It's all about communication. Many activities might seem like they are about communicating, but they're not. So for example, if you're reading a dialogue in a textbook with a friend, you might be thinking that, yeah, it's a dialogue, so we are communicating. But you're not exchanging any information, and there is no purpose to this communication beyond the fact that you're reading the textbook. On the other hand, if I'm using Chinese to tell you something you didn't know, and preferably something that you find interesting, that is real communication. And here, of course, we're talking about listening specifically. So I'm talking about listening with a purpose and listening for meaning, for communication. It can be one-way communication, right? So if you're listening mainly to see what words sound like or how this text is read aloud, or if you're trying to fill in gaps or something, your focus is not really on the meaning and you are not communicating, or someone is not communicating with you. And like I said, this is problematic because in order to deal with real situations where meaning and purpose is everything, you need to build strategies to deal with this, which won't happen if you don't practice it. For more context about this, check out episode 94, where we talked about Paul Nation's 4 strands. These are essentially 4 things that you should be doing to roughly the same degree, and 3 of them are focused on meaning. And just to clarify, when I say meaning here, I mean the meaning behind words. Why are you saying this and what are you trying to communicate, as opposed to form. So for example, how is this pronounced? What grammar pattern did I use? How does that work? And so on. That is not meaning focused, but it's focusing on the spoken form of the language. So principle 3 in a nutshell then is about focusing on meaning, on communication. And if you're just listening rather than participating in a conversation, this is then of course somebody else communicating with you in spoken Mandarin. This leaves us with key principle number 4. Enjoy yourself, make it sustainable. As I said earlier in this episode, and as I've said many times on the podcast before, if you don't invest enough time, you won't learn. And the best way to invest more time is to enjoy it, because then it's fun to learn and you don't have to force yourself to do something just because you want to reap some of the benefits that I mentioned earlier, perhaps. I'm not going to say too much more about this because I think it's rather self-explanatory. We also talked about long-term motivation in episode 188, if you really do want to listen to me talk more about this. And I also have an article from way back called Have Fun Learning Chinese or Else, which I'm not going to link to because it's not particularly good, but the title really says it all. You need to find a method and content that you like and that you enjoy using, and if you can do that and find ways of learning that you find meaningful and interesting in and of themselves, you will also spend much more time and you will learn much more than if you don't. And of course, you will also enjoy the journey more as well. So those are the 4 key principles to improve your Mandarin listening comprehension. Listen more, understand more, communicate more, and finally, and maybe most importantly, enjoy yourself. If you want a full video course focusing on how to implement these things in practice, check out The Fluent Listener, or stay tuned for next week's episode where I will talk more about the course. Thank you for tuning in to the Hacking Chinese podcast. If you like this episode, please share it. More information and inspiration about learning and teaching Chinese can be found at hackingchinese.com. See you in the next episode, and until then, good luck with your studies.